There is a specific kind of rot that hides behind the smell of expensive perfume and champagne on New Year's Eve. It is the stench of people pretending they haven't spent the last decade tearing each other apart for spare change. I am May Peterson, and I know that smell well. My parents sold the roof over my head just to fund my brother's ego, discarding our family history like it was trash. They think they are visiting a stranger's mansion tonight, but they are walking into a trap I spent 5 years building. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The silence in the house was not empty. It was expectant. The silence in the house was not empty. It was expectant. It hummed with the quiet confidence of a structure that had stood for 120 years, absorbing the secrets of generations into its plaster lath and heart pine floors. I stood in the center of the foyer, my fingers tracing the newly restored wainscoting. The wood felt cool and smooth, alive under my touch. The air smelled of cinnamon sticks simmering in apple cider, fresh pine boughs draped over the banister, and the faint underlying scent of beeswax polish. It was the smell of a home that was loved, a sharp contrast to the biting wind that rattled the stained glass transom window above the heavy oak door. It was New Year's Eve, the hinge upon which the past swings into the future, and I had never been more terrified nor more ready. I checked my watch. 6:45 p.m. They would be here any minute. I walked into the kitchen, my heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm on the floorboards I had laid with my own hands. The hors d'oeuvres were arranged with architectural precision, stuffed mushrooms aligned in perfect rows, caprese skewers, standing like little soldiers. I adjusted a linen napkin that was a fraction of an inch out of place. This need for control, for structural integrity in a chaotic world, was not just my profession. It was my armor. I was an architect, a preservationist of history, but tonight I was just a daughter waiting for the people who had taught me that foundations could be cracked without warning. My nervousness wasn't about the party. It was about the ghosts I was inviting back inside. As I poured a glass of sparkling water, the bubbles rising furiously to the surface, my mind drifted back to a sweltering afternoon 7 years ago. The memory was as vivid as a blueprint in my mind. It was my college graduation. The sun had been relentless, baking the football stadium until the air shimmered off the bleachers. I sat in a sea of black gowns, sweat trickling down my back, clutching the program so hard the paper turned to pulp. When they called my name, May Peterson, magna cum laude, I walked across the stage, shaking the dean's hand, but my eyes were scanning the crowd. I was looking for my father's gray thinning hair, for my mother's bright floral blouse. I smiled for the official photographer, but inside my chest was a hollow cavity. They weren't there. I found out later over a voicemail left 3 hours after the ceremony that they had skipped it. They weren't in the hospital. They weren't stuck in traffic. They were in a conference room at a Sheraton hotel 2 towns over, listening to a pitch meeting for my brother Caleb. Caleb, 2 years older and perpetually on the verge of his big break, needed moral support for a guaranteed investment opportunity in cryptocurrency kiosks. He was the golden child, the one who dazzled with charisma, while I worked quietly in the shadows. To them, my degree in architecture was a hobby. Caleb's schemes were destiny. That graduation snub was painful, but it was just a crack in the drywall. The collapse of the foundation came 6 months later. The Peterson ancestral home was a Victorian beauty, a Queen Anne with a turret and a wraparound porch that had hosted 3 generations of Peterson weddings, wakes, and christenings. It was the only place I had ever felt truly safe. I knew which floorboard creaked in the hallway and which window stuck in the humid July heat. It was our legacy. Or so I thought. I had come home for Thanksgiving that year to find boxes packed. The walls were bare, leaving pale rectangles where the family portraits had hung. My stomach had dropped a sensation of freefall that I still felt sometimes in my nightmares. They sat me down at the kitchen table, the only piece of furniture left, and told me the news. They had sold the house. "It's a liquid asset, May," my father had said, refusing to meet my eyes. Caleb has a chance to get in on the ground floor of a logistics startup. This is it. This is the one. You sold our home, I whispered, looking at my mother. Without asking me. We didn't want to worry you, she said, patting my hand as if I were a child who dropped an ice cream cone. Besides, it's just brick and mortar. Family is what matters, and family helps each other. Caleb needs this capital to secure our future. They sold our history to give Caleb a gambling stake. They sold the oak tree I climbed, the attic where I hid the kitchen, where my grandmother taught me to knead dough. And the worst part was who bought it. They didn't sell it to a young family who would cherish it. They sold it to a shell company, a faceless LLC that specialized in holding properties for overseas investors. The house was boarded up, stripped of its dignity, and left to rot, while Caleb took the money and predictably lost every single dime within 18 months. The logistics startup was a Ponzi scheme. The money vanished like smoke. My parents were devastated financially and emotionally. They were forced to move into a 2-bedroom rental apartment in a complex called The Meadows, which had neither meadows nor charm. It was a cramped beige box with thin walls and fluorescent lighting. Caleb moved onto his girlfriend's couch, blaming the economy, the government, and bad luck, never once acknowledging the sacrifice of the Victorian house that had been immolated on the altar of his ego. That was the wrong. It wasn't just the money. It was the erasure of our past. It was the message that my stability was the price required for Caleb's potential. I shook the memory away, focusing on the present warmth of the kitchen. I had spent the last 5 years working 80-hour weeks, building a reputation as the best restoration architect in the state. I lived in a studio apartment the size of a closet, saved every penny, and waited. When the shell company finally offloaded the distressed asset, my childhood home, because the roof had begun to leak and the taxes were due, I was ready. I bought it through my own LLC, Phoenix Preservation. My name appeared nowhere on the deed. For the last 2 years, I had labored over this house. I stripped the cheap paint, repaired the rot, and sourced period-correct fixtures. I poured my grief and my anger into the mortar, sealing it away, transforming it into something beautiful. I wasn't just fixing a house. I was proving that I was the one worthy of the legacy. I had invited them here tonight under false pretenses. I told them I was hosting a New Year's gala for a wealthy, eccentric client who wanted a family atmosphere, and that my presence was required professionally. I asked them to come as my guests to support my career for once. They agreed, mostly because I mentioned the client was catering with prime rib and open bar, and my parents had been eating processed ham and boxed wine for years. My phone buzzed on the marble countertop, jarring me back to the moment. The screen lit up with a text from my mother. "We are parked out front. Are you sure this is the right address? It looks like..." Well, you know. I picked up the phone, staring at the message. They were outside. They were looking at the house they had discarded, seeing it glowing with light, restored to a glory they had never been able to provide. They thought they were visiting a stranger's mansion. They had no idea that the daughter they overlooked was the one holding the deed. I didn't reply. I smoothed my dress, took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, and walked toward the front door. The brass lock felt cold and heavy in my hand. It was time to open the door. It was time to show them what I had built from the rubble they left behind. Before I could turn the lock on that front door and welcome my family into the past, I had to spend 5 years building a future that could sustain the weight of it. The road to this New Year's Eve didn't begin when I bought the house. It began the day I decided that if my family wouldn't provide a foundation, I would pour my own. After the graduation snub and the sale of the house, something hardened inside me. It wasn't bitterness exactly. It was the steel reinforcement of resolve. I threw myself into my career with a singular, terrifying focus. While my peers were navigating the social scenes of their late 20s or backpacking through Europe, I was in dusty archives and muddy construction sites. I became an architect, but not the kind who designs glass boxes in the sky. I specialized in historic preservation. There was something profound about taking a structure that society had deemed broken or obsolete, something discarded like I felt, and proving that its bones were still good. I saved libraries from demolition. I turned crumbling factories into vibrant lofts. I made a name for myself as the woman who could see value where others saw only debris. I lived like a monk. My studio apartment was sparse. I drove a 10-year-old sedan. I ate sandwiches for dinner. Every paycheck went into a high-yield savings account labeled the fund. I didn't know exactly what I was saving for at first, but I knew that in my family, money was the only language that commanded attention. If I wanted to be heard, I needed capital. Then 3 years ago, the alert popped up on my laptop screen. The Peterson house was back on the market. The shell company my parents sold to had neglected it. They had treated it as a line item on a spreadsheet, doing the bare minimum to keep it standing while waiting for the land value to spike. It hadn't. The roof had developed a leak that went unaddressed for a winter, damaging the plaster in the master bedroom. The curb appeal was gone, choked by weeds and neglect. The company wanted to liquidate the distressed asset. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the photos. It looked tired. It looked sad. But the lines were still there. The turret still reached for the sky. I called a lawyer friend immediately. "I want it," I told him. "But they can't know it's me. My parents, the realtors, no one. It has to be a blind purchase." We formed an LLC named Second Chance Holdings. I poured every cent I had saved into the down payment and took out a mortgage that terrified me. When the keys were finally mine, I didn't celebrate. I drove to the property at midnight, parked down the street, and walked up the driveway. The house loomed in the darkness, a dark silhouette against the moon. I placed my hand on the peeling paint of the porch column. "I'm back," I whispered, "and I'm going to fix you." But I couldn't do it alone. The damage was extensive. I needed a contractor who understood old-world craftsmanship, someone who wouldn't just rip out the horsehair plaster and replace it with drywall. More importantly, I needed someone discreet. If I hired a local crew, gossip would spread through our small town like wildfire, and my parents would know within a week that I had bought their old home. That would ruin everything. I didn't want them to know until I was ready. There was only one man for the job: Arthur. Arthur had been my father's best friend since high school. They were inseparable until the graduation incident. Arthur was the one who sat in the stands that day cheering for me while my parents were at that hotel. When my father sold the house to fund Caleb's scheme, Arthur had told him it was a mistake, a betrayal of the family legacy. My father, prideful and defensive, had cut him off. They hadn't spoken in years. I found Arthur at his small workshop on the edge of town, sanding a cabinet door. He looked older, his beard grayer, but his hands were just as steady. When I told him what I had done, he stopped sanding. He looked at me over the rim of his safety glasses, then down at the blueprints I had rolled out on his workbench. "You bought it back," he said, not a question, but a statement of awe. "I did. But it's a mess, Arthur. The roof, the floors, the plumbing. I have the vision, but I need your hands. And I need your silence." He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded slowly. "Your dad. He's a damn fool, May. He traded gold for fool's gold. I'll help you. And I'll do it at cost. Not for him. For you. And for the house. That house deserves better." Thus began the double life. By day, I was the high-powered architect managing million-dollar commercial projects. By night and on weekends, I was in coveralls covered in dust, working side by side with Arthur. The restoration was grueling physical work, but it was also the most healing thing I had ever done. There is a specific kind of peace found in the rhythm of manual labor. We spent weeks just stripping the layers of cheap varnish off the grand staircase. My shoulders ached. My fingers were raw, but as the original grain of the oak emerged rich and honey-colored, I felt like I was uncovering my own history. Arthur taught me how to steam bent wood and how to reglaze the original wavy glass windows. We worked mostly in silence, the only sounds the rasp of sandpaper and the classic rock playing low on Arthur's radio. "You have good hands, May," Arthur told me one afternoon as we were laying tile in the foyer. You respect the material. Your brother, he never understood that you have to build things. He just wanted to own them. It was a validation I hadn't realized I was starving for. But while I was rebuilding the past, the present kept intruding. The psychological tension was a tightrope I walked every day. My parents would call me usually on Sunday evenings to complain. "May, this apartment is freezing," my mother would whine into the phone. "The landlord won't fix the radiator, and the neighbors upstairs are so loud. I don't know how we ended up here." I would be standing in the master bedroom of the Peterson house, paint roller in hand, looking at the newly patched ceiling, feeling a pang of guilt that I quickly suppressed. "I'm sorry, Mom," I would say. "That sounds terrible." "And Caleb," she would continue, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's trying so hard, May. He has this new idea for importing wellness supplements. If he could just get a little seed money, maybe you could speak to him." "I can't, Mom. I'm busy with work." "You're always working," she'd sigh. "We hardly see you. Where are you anyway?" I hear an echo. "I'm at a job site," I'd lie. "A big restoration project. It's very demanding." "Well, don't work too hard. Remember, family is what's important." The irony was acidic. I was restoring their home, preserving their legacy, and they were lecturing me on family while asking for money for the brother who had squandered it all. Every call was a reminder of why I was doing this. I wasn't just fixing a house, I was preparing a lesson. I needed the house to be perfect. It had to be undeniable. It had to be a physical manifestation of the competence and care they had dismissed in me. There was a close call in November. I was up on a ladder cleaning the gutters, a job I refused to let Arthur do because of his bad knees, when a car slowed down in front of the house. It was a silver sedan similar to my father's. I froze, flattening myself against the roofline, my heart thundering against the shingles. If they saw me, if they stopped, the surprise would be ruined. The car lingered for a terrifying 10 seconds, then drove on. I exhaled, realizing I was trembling. The stakes felt impossibly high. By mid-December, the house was transformed. The floors gleamed. The walls were painted in heritage colors: sage greens, warm creams, and deep navies. We had restored the fireplace, bringing the chimney up to code so wood could burn there for the first time in decades. I furnished it slowly, hunting down antiques that matched the ones I remembered from my childhood. I even found a grandfather clock that was nearly identical to the one my father had sold. The pièce de résistance, however, was the height chart. It was pencil markings on the doorframe of the pantry. When the shell company bought the house, they had painted over everything with landlord white. I had spent 3 excruciating days with a heat gun and a scalpel, gently millimeter by millimeter peeling back the layers of latex paint until I found the pencil marks underneath. May, age 5. Caleb, age 7. May, age 10. I sealed it with clear coat. It was the only thing in the house that was strictly, undeniably ours. With the house ready, I initiated the final phase of the plan. The invitation. I called my parents a week before New Year's. I made sure my voice was bright, professional, and slightly breathless. "Mom, Dad, I have huge news," I said. "I've just finished the biggest project of my career. It's a historic estate in the countryside. The owner is this incredibly wealthy private investor, a nightmare to work for, honestly, but he's thrilled with the results." "That's nice, dear," my mother said, clearly distracted. "Did I tell you Caleb's car broke down?" "Listen," I cut in. "The client is hosting a New Year's Eve gala to show off the house. He insists that I bring my family. He wants to meet the people who raised me. It's a black tie affair, catered, open bar, very high society." The line went silent. I knew exactly which buttons I was pushing. My parents missed the status they used to have. They missed feeling important. "A gala?" My father's voice came on the line, perkier now. "Well, that sounds significant." "It is," I lied smoothly. "It's vital for my career that you're there, and Caleb too. I need to look like I come from a solid, supportive family. It creates the right image for these high-net-worth clients." "We would be honored," my father said, his voice swelling with unearned pride. We'll be there. It's about time you included us in your success. I hung up the phone and leaned against the kitchen island of the Peterson house. My hands were shaking again, but this time it was adrenaline. They had taken the bait. They thought they were coming to leech off the glamour of a stranger. They had no idea they were walking into a mirror. I looked over at Arthur, who was packing up his tools for the last time. They said yes, he asked. They said yes. Arthur nodded, closing his toolbox with a final decisive click. Then you better get ready, May. The hardest part isn't building the house, it's living in the truth. Now, standing on the precipice of the new year, the stage was set. The house was a masterpiece. The trap was laid. And all I had to do was open the door. The doorbell chimes were the same ones I had grown up with, a deep two-note brass melody that resonated through the hallway. Bong bong. I took one final breath, holding the cool air in my lungs for a moment to steady my pulse, and reached for the knob. This was the threshold. On one side, the architect who had rebuilt herself. On the other, the daughter they had dismantled. I pulled the heavy oak door open. A gust of snowy wind swirled into the foyer, carrying with it my family. They stood huddled on the porch under the amber glow of the restored gas-style lantern. My father Robert was wearing his tuxedo from 20 years ago. It was tight across the shoulders and slightly frayed at the cuffs. My mother Linda wore a sequined gown that she must have found at a consignment shop. It was elegant, but dated, shivering slightly in the cold. And Caleb was in a rented suit that didn't quite fit, fiddling with his phone, looking bored before he'd even stepped inside. May, my mother exclaimed, her breath misting in the air. She moved to hug me, a cloud of heavy perfume enveloping us. My goodness, look at you. You look expensive. Happy New Year, Mom, I said, stepping back gently to usher them in. Come in, it's freezing. As they crossed the threshold, I watched my father. He hadn't said a word yet. He was stopped dead on the doormat, his head cocked to the side. That gate, he murmured, pointing back toward the street. The iron gate at the end of the walk. It still has that high-pitched squeak when the wind catches it. I allowed a small, tight smile. Old houses have their quirks, Dad. The owner likes to keep things authentic. I had greased every hinge in the house except that one. I wanted him to hear it. I wanted the auditory memory to trigger the slideshow in his brain. It's incredible. My mother whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the foyer. She spun in a slow circle, staring at the wainscoting, the coffered ceiling, and the grand staircase that curved upward like a wooden ribbon. It looks exactly like the old house, Robert. But better, cleaner, brighter. It's a Victorian, Mom, Caleb said dismissively, wiping his feet aggressively on the rug. They all look the same, cookie-cutter layouts from the 1890s. He looked around with a sneer of envy masked as critique. Though I guess this guy has forget-about-it money. Must be nice to throw cash at a teardown until it looks like a museum. Let me take your coats, I said, playing the role of the dutiful hostess. The client is finishing up a call in his study, but he insisted I give you the grand tour before drinks. I led them through the parlor. I had staged it perfectly. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I saw my father reach out and touch the mantelpiece. His hand lingered on a small notch in the wood, a burn mark from where an ember had popped out 40 years ago. He pulled his hand back as if the wood were hot. He looked pale. This layout, Robert said, his voice tight. It's very familiar. Historic Preservation Acts are strict, I explained smoothly. We had to maintain the original floor plan. We couldn't move walls even if we wanted to. We moved into the dining room. The table was set with the good china, not my family's old china, but a set I had found that matched the pattern my grandmother used to have. Blue willow. My mother gasped softly. We had plates like this, she said, her voice trembling. Oh, Robert, remember before the sale. Lots of people have blue willow, Linda, Robert snapped, though his eyes were darting around the room with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. He was recognizing the light fixtures. He was recognizing the way the floor sloped ever so slightly toward the window. The ghosts were crowding him. "So what's this guy's deal?" Caleb asked, wandering over to the sideboard and picking up a crystal decanter without asking. "Real estate tycoon tech bro, I've got a pitch deck on my phone for a supplement line that would blow his mind. If he's looking for tax write-offs, I'm his guy." "He's in restructuring," I said. "He takes failing assets and makes them profitable again." "Sounds boring," Caleb scoffed, putting the decanter down. "Passive income is where it's at." I led them toward the kitchen, but I stopped deliberately at the pantry door. This was the moment. The door was open and the interior light was on. The strip of wood frame where the height chart lived was illuminated clearly. My mother walked past it, then stopped. She backed up. She stared at the doorframe. The varnish gleamed over the pencil marks I had painstakingly revealed. May, age 5. Caleb, age 7. The silence that fell over the hallway was absolute. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. "Robert," my mother whispered. She reached out a shaking finger to touch the writing. "Robert, look." My father crowded in behind her. He stared at the handwriting, his own handwriting from 20 years ago. Caleb peered over their shoulders, his face slackening. "What is this?" Caleb asked, his voice losing its arrogant edge. "Is this a joke? How did they get this?" "How indeed," I said. My mother turned to me, her face pale, tears welling in her eyes. "May, I don't understand. Did the new owner... Did they find this? Why did they keep it? Who owns this house?" "Come into the living room," I said softly. "We should sit down." They followed me, stumbling slightly, their reality fracturing. We entered the main living space, the heart of the home. I stood by the fireplace, turning to face them. They looked small against the grandeur of the room, huddled together on the Persian rug. "You asked who owns this house." I began, my voice steady, devoid of the trembling I felt inside. "You sold it 7 years ago to a shell company, Apex Holdings LLC. You signed the papers, took the check, and handed over the keys without looking back." "We had to," Robert protested weakly, sinking onto the sofa. "For the business, for the family. Apex Holdings let it rot." I continued, ignoring his excuse. "They didn't care about the history. They didn't care about the notch in the mantle or the height chart in the pantry. They just wanted the land. But 3 years ago they defaulted, and another LLC bought it. Phoenix Preservation." "So," Caleb interrupted, though he looked sweaty. "So some other corporation bought it. What's the point? May is your boss, the CEO of Phoenix." "I am the CEO of Phoenix Preservation," I said. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Caleb laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound of disbelief. Come on, May, you draw blueprints. You don't have this kind of cash. This place is worth millions." "I bought it as a foreclosure," I said, locking eyes with him. "For pennies on the dollar. While you were losing the money Mom and Dad gave you, I was working 80-hour weeks. While you were buying new cars you couldn't afford, I was eating ramen and saving every cent. I bought it, I restored it, I own it." My mother sat down heavily next to my father. She looked from the walls to me, connecting the dots. You live here. This is your house." "Yes. But why lie?" Robert blustered, his face turning a mottled red. He was trying to summon anger to cover his shame. "Why bring us here under false pretenses, to humiliate us, to rub our noses in it?" "To show you," I corrected him. "You told me that this house was just an asset. You told me that sacrificing it was necessary for Caleb's success. I wanted you to see that you were wrong on both counts. The house wasn't the problem, Dad. And Caleb wasn't the solution." "Hey." Caleb stood up, his fists clenched. "You think you're better than me just because you got lucky with some real estate flip. It wasn't luck." I stepped forward, my voice rising for the first time, sharp as cracked glass. "It was work. It was 3 years of sanding floors until my hands bled. It was stripping 20 layers of paint off that banister. It was saving the things you threw away. You couldn't have done this alone, Robert muttered, shaking his head. He looked around the room, desperate to find a hole in my story, desperate to minimize my achievement. This craftsmanship, the crown molding, the electrical work. You're an architect, May not a builder. You hired a crew. You spent a fortune. You're just as bad as us throwing money at things. I didn't hire a crew, I said. I hired one man. Who? Robert demanded. Who would work for the peanuts you could afford? The door from the kitchen swung open. Arthur walked in. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt and dark jeans, holding a silver tray with 4 glasses of champagne. He looked solid, like an old oak tree that had weathered a hurricane. He didn't look at Caleb. He didn't look at Linda. He looked straight at Robert. The color drained from my father's face entirely. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. Arthur? Arthur walked to the coffee table and set the tray down with a deliberate clink. He stood up and crossed his arms. The silence stretched thick with 30 years of friendship and 7 years of betrayal. "Hello, Bob," Arthur said. His voice was gravelly and calm. You helped her," Robert stammered. "But we haven't spoken in 7 years," Arthur finished. "Since you told me I didn't understand vision because I wouldn't invest in Caleb's scheme. Since you sold this house against my advice." Robert struggled for words. He looked at the impeccable joinery of the bookshelves, the perfectly hung doors. He knew Arthur's work. He knew the man's soul was in the wood. "She did it all herself, Bob," Arthur said, his voice cutting through Robert's stammering. "I just held the hammer. I just kept the saw straight. But the sweat, the money, the heart, that was all May. You sold the history to buy a lottery ticket. She picked it out of the trash and saved it." Arthur moved to stand next to me, placing a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture of protection, of solidarity. "She's the only Peterson who respected this place," Arthur added, looking at Caleb, who had sunk back into the chair, deflated. "And now she's the only one whose name is on the deed." My father looked at Arthur, then at me. The bluster evaporated. The anger dissolved. All that was left was the crushing weight of the truth. He looked around the room, really seeing it for the first time, not as a lost asset, but as a testament to the daughter he had underestimated. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. The house was silent again, but this time the silence wasn't empty. It was the sound of a foundation finally settling into place. The only sound in the room was the popping of the fire, a sharp, rhythmic percussion that punctuated the sudden, devastating quiet. My father sat with his head bowed, his hands covering his face. A posture of defeat I had never associated with the man who used to lecture me on the importance of projecting confidence. Beside him, my mother was weeping softly, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her mascara leaving dark streaks on her cheeks. Caleb sat motionless, staring at the floorboards, his earlier arrogance deflated like a punctured tire. I didn't feel the rush of triumph I had expected. There was no surge of adrenaline, no desire to laugh or gloat. Instead, I felt a heavy, somber peace. It was the feeling of a fever breaking. "Why?" Robert whispered, finally lowering his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, looking older than I had ever seen him. "Why didn't you just tell us? Why the elaborate charade, maybe? Because you wouldn't have listened." I said, my voice calm and steady. I walked over to the fireplace, resting my hand on the cool marble of the mantelpiece, my mantelpiece. "If I had told you I bought the house, you would have tried to manage it. You would have told me how to renovate it. You would have tried to leverage it for another loan. I needed to do this on my own terms. I needed to know that I could build something that you couldn't tear down." I looked at them, taking in the tableau of my family. "You missed my graduation," I said. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was just a fact, a stone in the foundation. "You skipped the moment I became an architect to chase a business opportunity that evaporated. You taught me that value was something you chased, something you gambled for. But you were wrong. Value is what you build. It's what you save." Caleb shifted in his chair. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room, but this time he wasn't looking for things to mock. He was doing the math. "The foreclosure price," Caleb said, his voice raspy. "What was it?" I told him the number. It was shockingly low, the price of a shell, a broken thing nobody else wanted. Caleb flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's less than the seed money Mom and Dad gave me for the crypto kiosks." "Yes," I said. "It is." Caleb stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered lawn. For the first time in his life, the shield of entitlement cracked. He saw the tangible reality of what I had done with pennies compared to what he had destroyed with thousands. "I blew it," he muttered to the glass. "I burned through that money in 6 months on leases and marketing and garbage. And you bought this." He turned back to face me. "I always thought you were the boring one, May, the safe one, but you were just the smart one." It was the first genuine compliment my brother had ever given me. It wasn't wrapped in sarcasm, it was heavy with regret. He sat back down, looking at his hands. "I'm sorry, May. For the comments. For everything." I nodded, accepting it. "Thank you, Caleb." My mother looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. "We just wanted him to succeed, May. We thought if he made it big, he could take care of all of us. We didn't mean to leave you behind." "I know," I said gently. "But in betting everything on the lottery, you forgot to work for the paycheck. You sold our past to buy a future that didn't exist." Then the focus shifted to the two men in the room who had once been brothers in everything but blood. Arthur was still standing by the fireplace, his arms crossed, his presence a silent judgment. Robert looked at him, and for a moment the shame was palpable. It radiated off my father like heat. "I couldn't call you," Robert admitted, his voice cracking. "After the house was sold, after the money was gone, I couldn't pick up the phone, Art. I was too ashamed. I knew you were right. You told me not to sell. You told me Caleb wasn't ready." "I did," Arthur said, his voice devoid of malice but firm as iron. "I told you that you were selling your legacy for a pipe dream. But I didn't stop being your friend because you made a mistake, Bob. I stopped because you cut me out. You were too proud to let me see you fail." "I was," Robert whispered. "I am." "Well," Arthur said, uncrossing his arms and picking up the champagne bottle to refill a glass, not for himself, but for Robert. "You failed. The house was ruined. The money is gone. But your daughter fixed it. She saved you from your own mistake. You should be looking at her, not me." Robert looked at me. It was a look I had waited 30 years for. It was respect. Not the doting love for a child, but the respect one adult gives another when they realize they have been surpassed. "You really did all this?" he asked, gesturing to the room, to the life I had constructed. "Every nail," I said. "Every permit. Every bill." "I'm sorry I missed your graduation." He said the words heavy and awkward on his tongue, unused to such admissions. "I'm sorry I sold the house." "I know," I said again. The dynamic in the room shifted, then a physical sensation, like the settling of a house foundation. For my entire life, I had been the subordinate, the child, the backup plan, the observer. Now I was the center of gravity. I was the homeowner. They were the guests. I walked over to the sideboard and poured a glass of water for my mother, bringing it to her. She took it with shaking hands, murmuring a thank you that felt deferential. "So," Caleb asked, breaking the tension, though his voice was subdued, "what happens now? Do we move back in? I mean, Mom and Dad hate the apartment." The question hung in the air. My parents looked at me, a sudden spark of hope in their eyes. The restoration of the status quo, the return to comfort. I stood straight, smoothing the fabric of my dress. This was the final test. The old May would have said yes immediately, desperate to please, desperate to buy their affection. But the architect who had rebuilt this house knew better. You don't put heavy furniture on a floor until the varnish has cured. "No," I said. The word was soft, but it landed with the weight of a gavel. "You are guests here." I continued meeting their gazes one by one. You are welcome to visit. You are welcome to celebrate holidays here. But you do not live here. This is my home. I built it. I paid for it. But May, my mother started, the apartment is so small. It's what you can afford, I said not unkindly. And until you learn to value what you have giving you, this would just be another mistake. Caleb needs to learn to build, not just take. And you need to learn to be parents to the daughter you have, not the son you wished was a millionaire. I looked at Arthur. He gave me a barely perceptible nod of approval. However, I added, seeing the devastation on their faces and softening the blow, because this was about justice, not cruelty. The guest rooms are always open for weekends, and we have a lot of catching up to do. The tension broke. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything was instantly forgotten, but it was real. The lies were gone. The pretenses were stripped away. We were sitting in the wreckage of our family dynamic, but for the first time in years we were sitting on a solid floor. Robert took the glass of champagne Arthur had poured. He looked at the bubbles rising, then at Arthur, and finally at me. To the architect, he said, his voice thick with emotion. To the architect, Arthur echoed. We drank. The champagne was cold and sharp. Outside the wind howled against the sturdy Victorian walls, but inside the fire was warm and the house held us all safe and sound. The grandfather clock in the hallway began to whir, a rhythmic mechanical clearing of its throat before the inevitable chime. It was a sound I remembered from my earliest childhood, a sound that signaled the steady, unyielding march of time. But tonight, as the hands crept toward midnight, the sound didn't feel like a countdown to an ending. It felt like a heartbeat. The tension in the living room had broken, replaced by a tentative, fragile peace. It wasn't the boisterous, performative happiness of our past family gatherings where we pretended everything was perfect while the foundation rotted underneath us. This was quieter. It was the hush of a job site after the demolition is done, right before the rebuilding begins. I moved to the kitchen to bring out the rest of the food, the prime rib sliders and the deviled eggs I had prepared hours ago. My mother followed me. She didn't hover or criticize, she simply picked up a tray of napkins and began folding them into triangles, her hands working with a nervous, penitent energy. The kitchen, she said softly, running her hand over the soapstone counter. You kept the original layout, but the cabinets, these are new, restored. I corrected her, sliding the tray of food onto the island. Arthur and I stripped them down. We found the original chestnut wood underneath the white paint you guys added in the 90s. She flinched slightly at the mention of the paint, but she nodded. It's beautiful, May. It has character. I suppose we spent so much time trying to make things look new, we forgot how to make them look good. It was a small admission, but a significant one. In the other room, I could hear the low rumble of male voices. I peeked through the doorway. Robert and Arthur were standing by the fireplace. The distance between them physically and emotionally had shrunk. My father was no longer posturing. He was listening. Arthur was gesturing to the mantelpiece, explaining, I assumed, how we had reinforced the chimney. It was a conversation about structure, about how things are held together. It was the first honest conversation they'd had in a decade. Caleb was sitting on the ottoman, staring into the fire. He looked stripped down, his ego dissolved by the reality of the evening. He wasn't on his phone, he wasn't pitching a scheme, he just looked tired. I walked over to him holding 2 coasters. I handed him one and sat down on the adjacent chair. The woodwork, Caleb said, not looking at me. The way the baseboards meet the floor. It's tight, no gaps. That's Arthur's work, I said. He's a perfectionist. It must be nice, he murmured, to make something that actually stays. Everything I touch seems to dissolve. That's because you're trying to build the penthouse before you pour the slab, Caleb, I said. It wasn't a rebuke, it was an observation. You want the result without the process. He looked at me, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. I don't know how to do anything else, May. I'm 30 years old. I have a resume full of failed startups and a leased BMW I can't afford. I don't have a trade. I don't have this. He gestured around the room. I looked across the room at Arthur. He caught my eye and gave a subtle nod. We had discussed this possibility, a contingency plan for the peace I hoped to broker. Arthur needs a laborer, I said. Caleb blinked. What? Arthur, I repeated. His crew is booked solid for a restoration project on the old library downtown starting next week. He needs a guy to haul lumber mix mortar and sweep up sawdust. It pays $18 an hour, hard labor, early mornings. Caleb laughed a short, incredulous sound. You want me to be a construction worker? May I have a business degree? A degree hasn't built you a life, Caleb, I said, my voice firm. This isn't a handout. I'm not giving you money. I'm offering you a chance to learn how a house is actually built. If you show up on time, if you work hard, if you listen to Arthur, maybe in a year or two you'll actually know something about value. Or you can go back to the apartment and wait for the next crypto boom. It's your choice. Caleb looked at his hands, soft, uncalloused hands that had never held a hammer. He looked at Arthur, who was watching him with a stoic, challenging expression. Then he looked at the house, the sturdy, beautiful reality of it. 18 an hour, Caleb asked quietly. Start time is 600 a.m., Arthur called out from across the room, not missing a beat. Don't be late. I don't wait for anyone. Caleb took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, I'll be there. It was a small victory, but it felt like a triumph. The clock in the hall gave a loud click, signaling 5 minutes to midnight. We should pour the champagne, Robert said, his voice surprisingly steady. He moved to the bottle on the coffee table. He poured 5 glasses. He didn't rush. He handed one to Linda, one to Caleb, one to Arthur, and one to me. He held his own glass up to the light, watching the bubbles rise. I made a mistake, Robert said, addressing the room but looking at me. A lot of them. I thought my job as a father was to secure a fortune for you kids. I thought money was the legacy. When I sold this place, I thought I was being a visionary. He shook his head, a rueful smile touching his lips. Turns out, I was just blind. I couldn't see that the legacy wasn't the asset value. It was the home. He turned to Arthur. I'm sorry I shut you out, Art. You were the only one telling me the truth, and I punished you for it. Water under the bridge, Bob, Arthur said, clinking his glass against my father's. Just don't let the current take you again. Then my father turned to me. He looked at the woman standing in the center of the room, not the little girl he had ignored, not the quiet student he had overlooked, but the woman who had outmaneuvered, outworked, and outlasted his own failures. To May, Robert said, his voice thickening with emotion. He raised his glass higher. I used to think you were just drawing pretty pictures. But tonight, I see it. You didn't just fix the walls, honey. You fixed us. To the architect of this family. To the architect, my mother whispered, tears streaming freely now. To the architect, Caleb said, lifting his glass with a newfound respect. To the architect, Arthur rumbled, his eyes twinkling with pride. We drank. The champagne was crisp and cold, washing away the dust of the past 7 years. The grandfather clock began to strike. Bong, bong, bong. The deep, resonant notes filled the house, vibrating through the floorboards, through the soles of our feet, grounding us. Outside, the world was cold and uncertain. The shell company my parents had sold to was gone. The get-rich-quick schemes had failed. The pretense was over. But inside, the fire was warm. The walls were straight. The roof was sound. As the final chime faded into silence, welcoming the new year, I felt a profound sense of completion. I hadn't just taken revenge. Revenge is a fire that burns everything down. This was something else. This was restoration. I had stripped away the rot, sanded down the rough edges, and applied a finish that would last. My family was here. They weren't living here, that boundary remained firm, and they respected it, but they were present. Caleb had a job, my parents had a reality check, and Arthur had his friend back. Later, after the glasses were cleared and the guest rooms were assigned for the night, Because I wasn't heartless enough to send them out into the snow, I stood alone at the large bay window in the living room. I looked out at the front lawn, blanketed in pristine white snow. I saw the oak tree standing tall and black against the moonlight. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, feeling the warmth of the house behind me. They say you can't go home again. They're right. You can't go back to what was because time changes everything. But if you have the will and the patience and the right foundation, you can build a new home on the old footprint. You can take the wreckage and make it a fortress. I smiled, my reflection in the glass overlaying the snowy world outside. I was May Peterson. I was an architect. And for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I belonged. And so May proved that the strongest foundations are often the ones we have to lay for ourselves. If you found satisfaction in her journey from overlooked daughter to the architect of her own destiny, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Tell us below, did her family deserve that second chance? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.